Census data report that was just released earlier today to talk about the implications of the data and what should we expect as folks are in the scramble to use that data to create new forms of political power. Now, joining us on our panel tonight is Reese Colbert, who serves as the founder of Black Women Views, Dr. Greg Carr, chair of the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University, and Amisha Cross, who is a political analyst and Democratic strategist. Thank you all, folks, for being on the panel tonight. Good to have you on.
Good to be here.
Let's start off talking about this situation. All right, Dr. Carr, I'm gonna start with you. I remember there was some time ago, Doc, and I might be going over some people's head, but I remember in the 90s, there was a big conversation going into the 2000s, but there was like in the late 90s, there was a big conversation about the browning of America. For years, some have talked about the browning of America. Some say that really started to take place when Barack Obama became a president. Some say that it really, when they put out there that America would look different by, and I think at that time they were talking about 2040. But looking at how this latest data confirms that the white population is on a decline while others of us are on an incline, how should we see this potential growth of power?
Well, I think ultimately the United States will dissolve. It probably won't dissolve in our lifetimes, but certainly the trajectory is toward dissolution. Because we're talking about a race-based settler state where white nationalism, white supremacy has been the foundation for the country. And as a result, the threat of being overwhelmed by non-whites is a running theme in American history. You can look back to the Constitutional Congress, look at Ben Franklin talking about it as early as the late 18th century, and then come forward to the really beginning of the 20th century. Latrobe Stoddard wrote a book called The Rising Tide of Color. This comes in maybe 40 years after the 1885 Chinese Exclusion Act, where they start worrying about the number of non-whites coming into the country. And at that time, non-whites was broad enough to include folks like the Italians, if you can remember. And then, of course, we have the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, which is the first major piece of federal legislation that tries to close the door, or at least shut the door a little bit, on non-whiteness. So this has been a running theme in American history. Soon, white people will be the largest minority in the country. This country will be majority non-white. That doesn't mean that everybody in the non-white group is going to vote the same way, which brings us to the census. I think that this positive moment we'll have finally, just to kind of begin this conversation, this positive moment we're going to have is it's going to end up in the courts. We may look at pay attention to the concept of opportunity districts. The Voting Rights Act, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act says that if you can determine in a state that quote unquote minority voting power and strength has been diluted, and that is defined by determining whether or not 50% of that district is minority or not, you are under federal law, under the Voting Rights Act, required to create an opportunity district. So folks who are thinking that these white nationalists in the Republican Party can kind of gerrymander their way into permanent minority rule, like a kind of neo-Rhodesia, it's not that simple. And we can talk more about it as we go on, but that's just some opening thoughts.
I appreciate that, Doc. I want to get your take on this as well, Reese. Does this report surprise you? And from a cultural and political vantage point, how do we make sure that the interests of Black people stay at the forefront where our issues aren't lost as the brown community continue to grow?
Well, I mean, you make a good point, Faraji. I think in terms of democratic politics, we're starting to see the kind of shift towards courting Latino voters, and they're not a monolith, just as Black voters are not a monolith. But I think the more important pressing issue that we have is, as Dr. Carr stated, gerrymandering. I'd like to think that there will be some protection in the courts. They have ruled in the favor of, minority rights and minority representation. That is, until now, we have a 6 three court, which is predominantly conservative and right wing even. So I think that the census is really important because I think it's going to trigger that much more urgency from the Republican Party to try to get as much of this minority rule enshrined as they can, while they're the majority, and they're going to do the gerrymandering that we've talked about. I wonder, though, if the efforts that the Trump administration took to try to suppress the census turnout actually is part of what's driving this demographic change. There were more pushes in minority communities and with different groups to fill out the census as opposed to the Republicans, who were very much down on the census, and Donald Trump tried to cut back on the resources for that. And that could be part of it. So it could be a data issue. But there's no doubt that this country is becoming more diverse. And I think that we're going to have more nuanced conversations when it comes to politics, because just because somebody is not Black or not white doesn't mean that they are aligned with us, as, you know, like people like to put us under the umbrella of people of color. It's definitely not that simple. And Black people are going to have to make sure that we exercise our considerable electoral power to keep our interests at the forefront.
Amisha, and speaking of electoral power, now that people are scrambling to redistrict a lot of the areas across the country to meet the fall deadline. Some states have already, passed some of their deadlines, but they're trying to get it in place for the midterm elections coming up next year. My big question is, because we often talk about census data, we look at the data, but how do we make sure that we use this data that's going to garner some real political power, especially for Black political leadership? How can they use this data to gain power, as well as to empower citizens to get more civically involved?
Before I answer that, I'm going to double down on something that Reese said a moment ago. I think that we have to remember, in the context of talking about the census, that those numbers, though they are helpful, we also have to remember that the Black participation in the census was extremely underrepresented. And we can recognize that by the amount of counties and the amount of districts that are actually going to lose, funding for things like hospitals and various other resources that are extremely important, especially to African Americans, because the African American participation in the census was actually quite low. With that being said, I think that we have to look at the fact that the importance of consistently advocating for ourselves, the importance of consistently pushing for advancements in healthcare and healthcare equity, educational equity, housing equity. These are things that we have to do not only in census years, but also in midterm years and off election years, and ensuring that those who are in elected positions and elected capacity have their feet to the fire when it comes to not only promising us things on the campaign trail, but also getting those things done once they're actually in office. I think that one of the most tragic things about policy when it comes to the African American community is that the majority of people who look like those of us on this panel are looking towards the White House for solutions, and the White House only, and Congress only. We need to re-envision the understanding of state and local government power, because at the end of the day, the effects and the change that matter the most on a daily basis to the Black community specifically are going to be done at the state and local level. You want to see police reforms? Guess what? That happens from the mayor's office. That happens from city council. You can make that happen at your county government level as well. You want to see advancements in how education funding happens. Make sure that you know your state legislative bodies. There are so many things that we can do without a dependency on the Biden administration or Congress. And I think that once our population has a better grasp on how policy is made locally, we will see some things move a bit more swiftly, and we'll see advocacy at the local level. Because again, redistricting is happening, and it's not only happening in red states, it's happening across other states as well. Voter suppression is happening. It's not only happening in the South, it's happening in the North as well. There are so many things that should be not only flash in the pale instances or things that mainstream media focuses on, but also things that we focus on within our own communities. And as someone who is a native of Chicago, when I hear individuals say over and over again, voting rights is not something that matters to us, it's not affecting the state of Illinois, or it's not affecting Chicagoans, I would argue that you are 100% incorrect, because when one of us is hurt, all of us is hurt. And we have to align in fighting with our brothers and sisters across this country. Because as the census points out, and as we see with a lot of the rising people of color numbers, that's not us. Black people are not a large portion of that rising number. Actually, our numbers are dwindling. When it comes to the census specifically, the population that's rising in this country the fastest and has been on that trajectory for nearly 20 years now is the Latinx community. And that shows no signs of stopping. So there's a reason why we see Republicans courting the Latinx community. And to Donald Trump's credit, be it whether it's good or bad, I would argue bad in this case, he actually increased the vote margins for Republicans when it came to the Latinx vote. For Democrats, there's still this consistent push to try to figure out what the Latinx community wants. And again, to back up what Reese said a moment ago, because they are not a monolith, just like Black people are not a monolith, but I would argue that the Latinx community is a little bit different because Black people do vote largely in lockstep in support for the Democratic Party. The Latinx community does not. And I think that because that vote is up for grabs, you're going to see both parties try to kowtow to the needs of the Latinx community. And unless the Black community rises up consistently, we're not going to see those same level of prioritization.
And it brings me to that point that you just brought up, Amisha, around, should there be a greater effort to create a stronger alliance between Black and brown communities because we are seeing that growth from Latino communities, because we're seeing a greater engagement? Would it be in the best interest for Black folks to start to build alliances and political alliances with Latino and Hispanic communities? Reese, I'll start that question off with you.
Absolutely. I think we should align with people on issues, specific issues where there are areas of mutual benefit. And that goes for the Latinx community, that goes for the Asian community, that goes for any community. We have intersectionality because I would remind you that there are Black Latinos with a variety of different demographics. And so we should not be limited to just only thinking that we're all on our own and we need to get something that's only for Black people and nobody else, because that is not going to be a successful strategy. So when you look at areas like COVID, Black and Latino have higher rates of hospitalization and higher rates of mortality. And pretty much every facet of American life and where systemic racism plays, Black and Latino people are both demographics are impacted by these inequities. And so I think the challenge comes in the fact that, there isn't an overall appeal that you can make to all Latinos or Latinx people that would appeal to them just the same as it is when it comes to Black people. But yes, we are not enemies. We're natural allies just when you look at the data. And so I think it's time that we really start to form those partnerships. We have them in a lot of places, so it's not that it's not already happening, but I think we have to look at it as something that's not just a Latino issue or not just a Black issue, but an area of, an issue of, I know I said don't call us all people of color because we're not all the same, but realistically speaking, we're going to have to start making stronger alliances with people across different spectrums because, as Amisha pointed out, our numbers are dwindling. Last week, we had a discussion about how the fact that 1 in 420 Black people have been killed by COVID. And so the landscape isn't improving fast enough for us, for our mortality or for our health outcomes, for us to take for granted the partnerships that we need to form. But that does not have to be at our expense. I should add that. That does not mean that we have to take a back seat to anybody else's interests. It just means that we need to lock hands with people and different organizations and different demographics that have a shared mutual benefit that we can all benefit from.
Dr. Carr, if we start taking such a big step of strengthening the alliances and really working to connect to the struggle of our brothers and sisters in the Latino community, this could really shake up not just politics. This could shake up economics. This could shake up education. I kind of think to a moment where Pat Buchanan, he talked about the death of the West. He wrote a book about the death of the West, and then he talked about the suicide of a superpower. But one of the key elements is that he started to see that white power was on the decline. So if we start taking those big, broad steps, we're fundamentally changing how America operates. Are we ready for that? And do we have the capacity to do that?
I think a great deal of this conversation is reliant on numbers and demographics, and what our experiences have shown us really contradict the assumptions sometimes we make about the nature of what we have to do. First of all, the idea of alliances and political alliances is something that we have shown great strength on over the last century. Remember, African people aren't brought into the electoral process really robustly until the 20th century and really the second half of the 20th century. And the United States isn't a nation. I know we like to call it a nation, but by that I mean there's no common culture as such. There's a lot of myth making, a lot of mythology. But to reinforce something that Amisha said a minute ago in terms of dealing with state and local elections and paying attention, this census data does tell us that about 9% the metro areas in this country, grew by 9%, and the top 10 cities in this country in terms of population for the first time in American history all have over 1 million people. New York City, where you see the Spanish-speaking community, the Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and others, if you look at their voting trends, they're very consistent with people of African descent who speak English, who we call African Americans. To Reese's point, a lot of those people up there, including several members of the Congressional Black Caucus, would be considered Afro-Latinos. Now, that's very different than Texas, but if we're talking about Texas, are we talking about San Antonio? Are we talking about Dallas? Are we talking about Houston? Things begin to dissolve in terms of this data when you start looking very granular. And when you look at the labor coalition, when you look at the 1960s and 70s, whether it be migrant labor, say the Chavez and those, that was part of a very important and strong labor movement. But the attacks in this country have been on trying to forestall that coalition, not on us trying to make the coalition. We have sustained it. Look at the Rainbow Coalition work of Jesse Jackson and them. For that matter, come forward to the 1980s and 90s and look at some of this youth energy that built those kind of coalitions. The other thing, last thing I'll say is this, when you see who has lost seats and who's gained seats, so when you see Montana and Oregon and Colorado, New York City, New York losing seats, and then you see, Montana, Oregon, Colorado, North Carolina, and Florida gaining seats, it doesn't mean that that kind of coalition in North Carolina is going to look the same as it does in Florida. And remember, mass white-facing media drives this Florida conversation as if Puerto Ricans in Florida and Cubans in Florida are the same, and a lot of those Cubans in Florida are revenge-minded white Cubans in South Florida, and their own children don't vote with them. So again, it is important to engage in this coalition political building and not to forget that this isn't something we're starting. It's the continuation of something we've been doing for over a century. And that's the thing that these, it's being driven as if we're trying to, do something we haven't been doing. They're working to keep us apart, and they're going to fail.
And that's the interesting part about it, Dr. Carr, because there are still some folks within our community that push back on this idea, that say, oh, no, we can't do, because they take our jobs. I've had conversations about this on my radio show. Folks are like, no, it's not happening. They're taking our jobs. They're doing this and they're doing that. The narrative around the struggle and the plight of the brown, the Latino community is a narrative based upon being a threat to Black progress. And I think that that's something that we really have to have some deeper conversations about to ensure that we can gain the type of power, and like you said, Dr. Carr and Reese, to in the long run, that there is some greater strides that are being made. Amisha, what's your take?
No, I think that that's absolutely correct. And I like Dr. Carr's breakdown specifically of the different demographics that actually come to play when we're talking about the Latinx community, because Florida and Texas are very diverse in their Latinx community, as well as the origins of those Latinx voters, as well as the ages. What is known is that younger Latinx voters tend to be a lot more liberal, a lot more progressive than their parents. It is what it is. With that, I would also argue that this unification that was brought up not only, in this conversation, but also through organizations like the Rainbow Push Coalition. This is something that a lot of civil rights leaders have been working on for a very long time. It hurts me to a certain extent, to a great extent, that we've seen this discussion that started in the conservative, alt-right, stratosphere about basically Latinos taking jobs, that is now kind of broken into the African American talk speak as well, largely because when white people decide that they want to divide and conquer, they are excellent at the messaging strategies to do so. They have been talking about this for generations now. And at this point, noticing that their own population is dwindling, that they are not going to be the majority, that originally this was predicted to happen in late 2040, possibly 2050. Now we're seeing it expedited. We're looking at 2022, 2025, that you're going to see a lot of these things happen and happen at a more hyper intense rate. I think that the push to talk about and to continue to distance themselves, as well as to push African Americans to distance ourselves from the Latino population, only benefits white people. That is done purposely, because if you were to join these two groups who have largely a lot of the same issues when it comes to education failures, when it comes to failures of our environmental system, when it comes to failures of our hospital system, when it comes to failures in equity, these are things that are shared by both African Americans and those from various Latinx backgrounds. If you were to combine and to join together and to have those conversations and to link up in advocacy and pushing for reforms and change, then that would be one powerful and unstoppable group. And I think that what we're seeing amongst very strategic white people is that an understanding that that is exactly what it is. They do not want that coalition to happen. They have fought very hard to make it never happen. And I think that at this point, it behooves us as African Americans not only to look towards our interests, which again, are shared interests in many cases with various members of the Latinx community, but to also look towards where our leadership is actually going. We see, to Dr. Carr's point, Congressional Black Caucus members who are also Afro-Latino and Congressional Black Caucus members who have linked up with organizations like Unidos, who understand the importance of making sure that we carry our Latinx brethren as well, because at the end of the day, a lot of our issues are the very same. When we're talking about public schools, the public school system in America is not driven by white students. 75% of them are brown and black students. That is the system. Our teachers are largely white women. Over 80% are white women. But the student population themselves, schools would not get funded without the black and brown kids that actually attend. We are the public school system. I think that at the end of the day, we have to ensure that we are fighting for those people, because no one else will.
And where does the next generation fit in on this? I mean, because you mentioned, Amisha, that like Dr. Carr and Reese, that there is a shift in attitudes from Latino youth, as well as I would even go as far as to say some even black youth. So where does the next generation fit into this? How do we use this information to empower the next generation?
Well, I think part of that is to move beyond. Right now, we see a lot of activism, hashtag activism. We see activism when it comes to advocacy in the streets. I think that it behooves us, everyone on this panel, as well as those within the listening audience, to teach some of our younger population. I mean, I'm a millennial, but I consider myself old at this point. This next generation is doing some excellent things. We have to teach them how not only to organize in a social media platform or to organize in the streets, but also how to understand policy, also understand the levers of government and how to utilize their voices in that way. Because right now, they've got the internet covered. They've got TikTok covered. They've got the streets covered. But what they don't necessarily always grasp is the policy. And I think that we have to do better, or our schools need to do better, at educating people on how state and local government works, what the levers are there, as well as how Congress actually works. Because our systems are not designed for youth to come up and shake things up. They're not. Mainstream media loves to see young people in the street. What they don't love to see young people doing is actually writing, understanding, and negotiating policy. And once we get our younger generation to that level, they will be unstoppable.
Reese, what's your take on that?
I completely agree with Amisha. I think, what we've seen over and over again, every election, there's going to be a surge of youth turnout, right? Oh, this is the candidate that's going to energize the youth vote, and it's going to be record breaking. And it doesn't necessarily materialize to the proportion that it could to be exponentially more impactful. And so I think, to Amisha's point, we have to find a way to engage with them into turning protests and activism into political votes. I mean, the reality is that is the mechanism through which change happens in this country on just a mechanical and administrative level. It happens through elected officials. And so I think it's very important to engage on that level. But another point I wanted to bring up was to your point, Faraji, about, some of the divisions that have been sown between the different groups within this country. I think one of the things we've seen, and I have an op-ed out today in the Griot about disinformation campaigns targeting the Black community. It's not specifically on this topic, but one of the things that we've seen is we've seen the pop-up of groups online, particularly Black groups that have very xenophobic attitudes. I won't name check them because I ain't trying to invite the bots and all the craziness, but what I will say is that there are very xenophobic, bigoted groups that are purportedly are presenting themselves as trying to advocate specifically for the Black community, but they're actually encouraging people to not vote. They're encouraging people to, sit out the electoral process, which is by default, obviously not advocating for us, because if we don't vote, we don't have a voice. We are giving our action to somebody else. So, but part of that xenophobic tint is to convince Black people that if it's not happening for us alone, then it's not worth supporting. And we know that's not true. And we know that it's going to be incredibly difficult to ever get anything that is only and specifically for Black people. Just like as people want to name check the Asian American, so-called anti-Asian American hate bill, which was not actually specifically only to Asians. It was something that actually benefits the number one victims of hate crimes, which are unfortunately Black people. So I think that we have to realize that there are forces, sometimes from within our community, sometimes infiltrating our community, that want to see us divided and try to tackle some of those attitudes, because we do have shared economic interests. As Amisha said, it's going to take the economic engine is going to change through alliance. And as Dr. Carr, pointed out, this is something we have been working together for. I'd also name check the Poor People's Campaign, the great work that the great Reverend Dr. Barber does to try to get people to see, see on an economic level how we all have shared interests. I'm not a fan of the race, not class argument. That's not the argument that he makes, but I think that's something that we need to realize. We can all come out ahead together on specific issues, and issues where we don't agree. Hey, we got to march to our own drum, the beat of our own drum, and do our own thing. But there are a lot of areas that we need to be linking hands with. But the last thing I'll say is one of the things that I was very angry about was the fact that that VP Kamala Harris was not replaced with the Black woman. And there was arguments that Gavin Newsom made, or that people were making, the Latino vote is significant in California, and, they deserve representation, as if leaving Black women with zero Senate representation was acceptable, and that a Latino senator, a male senator, when there are already several of them in the Senate, is an acceptable substitute for Black women specifically being there. So I do not mean by any means to suggest that other folks being in these roles are a substitute, as we've talked about local and state representation. They're not a substitute for us. They can be allies with us, but we still absolutely need to make sure that we are running for these positions, that we're voting for our candidates. We're not buying into the electability arguments that white is right, and that we're keeping our interests at the forefront.
Dr. Carr, I want to get your final take on that part of, as you're a professor, you're talking to young people, you see the next generation in the spaces. What do you tell them when information like this is put out there? What do you say to empower them?
Ignore white frameworks. That's why I went into Africana studies. You've got to ignore white frameworks. Don't turn that noise down. Turn it off. Turn it absolutely. Turn it off. They do not share our interest if they are still placing whiteness at the center of all of their logics. Understand that they're roughly speaking, this census will note there'll be about 330 million people in the United States right now. That's up 20 million from 10 years ago. So it isn't, the percentage of people of African descent who are seen as people of African descent first hasn't changed. But the numbers have grown, meaning that our population is growing too. It's just not growing in terms of percentage. And note the changes in the census over the last several decades, where they've tried to disaggregate by allowing people to check more than one box. This is, in other words, part of the politics of the census is trying to contain non-whiteness. So if you speak Spanish, you see, Hispanic doesn't mean anything. Understand that if this was a mathematical equation, we would be Anglos, Latinos and Anglos. Those who speak English first are Anglos. Now, does that mean we're black, white? So when you say Latino, you're really not saying anything. But that having been said, listen to young people. You want to look at some young people? Let's look at somebody like Jasmine Camacho Quinn. Jasmine Camacho Quinn won an Olympic gold medal last week for Puerto Rico. Now, some of y'all are saying, wait, I thought Puerto Rico was part of the United States. It is, but the International Olympic Committee allows territories to compete under their own flag. And although she was raised born in Puerto Rico, but raised in South Carolina, and her brother plays linebacker for the Chicago Bears, and if you listen to her, you wouldn't know she's running because her mama is from Puerto Rico and she was born there. Now, here's where it all comes together. There are 435 members of the House of Representatives. They don't want to change that number, which means that as the population shifts and people have babies and people migrate, they're going to take one from here, add it here. California loses one, Texas gains two. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But they have 100 senators. You know why they don't want to let Puerto Rico in, the Virgin Islands in? You know why they don't want Washington, D.C.? Because those seats would look like you and me. So they want to get people fighting over a language when if you look at Jasmine in her face and she never opens her mouth, you're going to put her down in the census as African American. And guess what? She is African American. She's African Caribbean American. Stop listening to white people. That's the rule on this topic. And many others, but since we're talking about this topic, on this topic.
Folks, back to our Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment. Ceek.com, we're partnering with them, of course. We appreciate their support right here on Roland Martin Unfiltered. Check out a couple of their products that you can take advantage of.
And you're watching us on Ceek. What's going on? This Quavo Huncho. Right now, you in the Huncho's world. Please let the music play.
Enjoy the Ceek.com video by using one of their virtual reality headsets. All you do is just pop your phone right here into the VR headset and enjoy the content. You can also take advantage of their 360-degree headphones. These headphones here come in a couple of colors, black and gold, but then also all gold. And so you can check these out. If you want to use our promo code to get a discount, it's RMVIP21, RMVIP21. Then, of course, a portion of the proceeds comes back to Roland Martin Unfiltered, which allows for us to fund the show. And so this is a black-owned company, and we certainly believe in supporting black-owned companies. Mary Spio is the founder. And so, again, go to Ceek.com and use the promo code RMVIP21.